A racist teacher bullied a young black girl in front of the entire class, mocking her hair and humiliating her in front of everyone, but what she didn't know was that the girl she chose to target was the daughter of the school's director, and what happened to that teacher left everyone in shock. It started in the middle of fourth period on a Thursday afternoon. The classroom was quiet, the hum of the projector filling the silence as students took notes. She was seated in the middle row, her notebook open, her curly hair pulled back into a puff that framed her face beautifully, proud, soft, natural. She wasn't talking, wasn't disturbing anyone, just doing what every other student was doing. But for some reason, maybe out of pure hate, or the need to control what she didn't understand, the teacher stopped mid-sentence, turned toward her, and said, loud and clear for the entire room to hear, "Your hair is distracting the class. I'm going to need you to tie it up, or maybe consider a different style altogether, something less wild." Silence. A silence so heavy it made the walls shrink. No one said a word. A few students looked down at their desks, others looked away uncomfortably, and a few chuckled, not because it was funny, but because cruelty always makes someone nervous enough to laugh. She froze, her heart racing, her cheeks burning with confusion and shame. Her hands gripped the edges of her desk. It wasn't the first time she'd felt singled out. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't a side comment, a passive-aggressive glare, or a dismissive tone. This was a direct attack, wrapped in a smile, delivered like a lesson. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to say something back. But all she could do was sit there, blinking fast, trying not to let the tears fall. Because if she cried, they'd win. Again. What that teacher didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was who exactly they had just tried to humiliate. That quiet black girl wasn't just another student. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't alone. And she definitely wasn't someone to mess with. She was the daughter of the person who ran the school. The director. But even more than that, she was someone who had been raised to stand tall, even when the world tried to shrink her. That classroom moment wasn't the beginning of the humiliation. It was the final straw. Because for weeks, the teacher had made little comments. Questioned her grades. Assigned her harder tasks than the others. Ignored her hand when she raised it. Subtly chipped away at her confidence every chance she got. And every time, the girl stayed silent, hoping it would pass, hoping it wouldn't escalate. But racism never stays subtle for long. That moment in the classroom changed everything. She didn't speak to the teacher. She didn't cry. She didn't storm out. She just sat there. Watching. Observing. Letting the silence speak for itself. But the second the bell rang, she didn't walk to her next class. She went straight to the office. Not to beg. Not to complain. But to let her father, the one person who knew exactly what she was capable of, see for himself that the fire he saw in her eyes at home wasn't just for show. From that moment on, things moved fast. The classroom incident hadn't just been heard, it had been filmed. A student in the back had recorded everything on their phone. The tone. The words. The expression on the teacher's face. It spread like wildfire. First among students. Then parents. Then online. The school's inbox flooded with emails. Phone lines rang off the hook. And suddenly, what was once a private humiliation became a public reckoning. Behind closed doors, the director launched an emergency meeting with the school board. Evidence was presented. Testimonies were given. Patterns were revealed. This wasn't the first time the teacher had been accused of unfair treatment, only the first time she'd been caught so clearly, so undeniably, in the act. And the teacher? She walked into that meeting like she had every right to be there, still holding her head high, still convinced that her position would protect her. But when she stepped into that room and saw who was sitting at the front, the student she humiliated, staring back at her with calm, quiet power, everything changed. What happened next stunned the staff. The director didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He played the video. He read the reports. And then, he looked the teacher dead in the eye and asked, "Would you like to explain what part of her hair was wild?" No answer. Just a shifting of feet, a reddening of the face, and a long silence that echoed everything she had tried to ignore. Within 24 hours, the decision was final. She was fired. Not suspended. Not reassigned. Not quietly moved to another district. Fired. And the girl? She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She just kept showing up. Head held high. Hair bigger and prouder than ever. Until one day, something even more powerful happened. The student body elected her to lead the new Inclusion and Equity Committee at school. And she accepted. With grace. With poise. With the kind of strength that no one could question anymore. But what she did during that first school-wide assembly shocked everyone. Not because of revenge. But because of the lesson she delivered in that gymnasium, one that not even the teacher who hurt her could have seen coming. And that's the part you'll want to hear. Because it wasn't just about punishment. It was about turning pain into purpose. So now the question is, what did she say in front of the entire school that left everyone in tears, including the very woman who once called her a distraction? Stick around to find out. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we support you, and your voice matters. This story, though fictional, is inspired by the real strength and dignity that lives in each of you. Racism has no place here, not in our stories, not in our reality. Now sit back and enjoy this powerful story, and if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now, let the story begin. Her name was Ayanna Green. 14 years old, 9th grade, a quiet girl with eyes that carried more depth than most people noticed. Her skin glowed like sun-kissed bronze, and her hair, thick, coiled, unapologetically full, was a crown she wore every day, whether or not anyone else had the courage to see it that way. She had transferred to Eastbridge Academy only 3 months ago, in the middle of the semester. It was a magnet school known for its rigorous curriculum, its sleek glass buildings, its digital smartboards, and its commitment to progressive education, at least that's what the glossy brochure said. But Ayanna, despite her calm demeanor, knew how the world worked. She wasn't looking for brochures. She was looking for truth. Her father, Marcus Green, had been appointed director of the school just before the school year started. A tall, composed man in his 40s, with a voice like steady thunder and a presence that shifted the temperature of every room he walked into. He believed in education as a tool for transformation. He had grown up in East Atlanta, raised by a mother who cleaned houses and a father who worked 2 shifts at a factory. His rise had been the kind that left people inspired, a full scholarship to Howard, a master's from Columbia, and years of service in underfunded districts before finally taking on a leadership role in one of the state's top-ranked schools. He didn't advertise his personal life. So when he enrolled his daughter under a different last name, his ex-wife's, it wasn't a political move. It was a decision born out of protection. He wanted Ayanna to be treated like any other student, not like the director's kid. And most of all, he wanted to see how the school truly functioned, beneath the surface. Ayanna didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't even want it. She had grown up watching her father build everything from scratch. She knew what earned respect looked like. So when she walked through the double doors of Eastbridge that first day, she kept her head down, her shoulders straight, and her silence sharp. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't overshare. But she paid attention. She noticed the way teachers subtly called on the same students again and again. The way some kids' mistakes were treated like learning moments while others were met with disappointment. She noticed the whispers. The stares. The invisible dividing lines in the cafeteria. And though no one said it out loud, she felt it every day, the unspoken message that she didn't quite belong. Her homeroom teacher was Mrs. Elaine Huxley. Mid-50s. Polished. Blonde bob always styled, lipstick never out of place. She wore long cardigans that draped past her hips and had a voice that could make kindness sound like condescension. She had taught at Eastbridge for 22 years and held a certain untouchable status among faculty. Parents adored her. Students feared her. She was the kind of teacher who claimed to be colorblind, but had never once asked how Ayanna pronounced her name. From the very first week, something about her energy made Ayanna uneasy. There was no outright hostility. Just the slow burn of being overlooked. Of being called on only when answers were hard. Of hearing praise heaped on others for effort Ayanna had matched, or exceeded, without acknowledgement. And then there were the moments that cut deeper. Like the time Ayanna wrote a poem about her grandmother for a creative writing assignment. It was raw, vulnerable, full of metaphor and memory. Mrs. Huxley gave her a C and wrote in red ink, "Too emotional. Try being more objective next time." Or the time Ayanna asked to go to the library for an independent project and was told, "Let's focus on getting your basics down first." She didn't argue. She never did. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to give anyone a reason to call her aggressive. At home, she didn't tell her father everything. He was busy. Meetings, phone calls, evaluations. She respected his work too much to weigh it down with her discomfort. But she paid attention to how he spoke about the school in the evenings, how he wanted to make it a safe place for every student. How he believed in accountability. And somewhere inside her, she wondered if he truly knew what was happening in his own halls. One Friday morning in October, Ayanna woke up early. She spent extra time on her hair, fluffing her curls into a halo, shaping them with care. It was picture day. She wanted to feel proud when she looked back on that photo. She walked into homeroom, sat in her usual seat by the window, and quietly pulled out her notebook. That day, Mrs. Huxley had planned an open discussion about identity and stereotypes, part of a school-wide campaign about diversity. It was supposed to be inclusive. It was supposed to give every student a voice. Until it didn't. Midway through the period, as Ayanna shared a thoughtful comment about cultural identity and how hair is part of heritage, Mrs. Huxley interrupted her mid-sentence and said it. That sentence. That cruel, dismissive sentence that landed like a slap across the face. Your hair is distracting the class. I'm going to need you to tie it up, or maybe consider a different style altogether, something less wild. The room froze. Students glanced around, unsure of what to do. Ayanna's mouth went dry. Her face burned. Her fingers dug into the edge of her desk. And for a moment, she considered shrinking. Apologizing. Doing what was expected. But then something shifted. A quiet defiance bubbled up. Not anger. Not rage. Just clarity. She looked directly at Mrs. Huxley. And said nothing. After class, she didn't go to second period. She walked the halls without urgency, each step deliberate, until she reached the main office. She asked to speak with the director. The receptionist, unaware of their relation, gave her a polite smile and said he was in a meeting. Ayanna said she'd wait. And she did. For 27 minutes. Sitting silently, eyes forward, not moving. When Marcus finally stepped out of his office and saw her, something in his face softened. He hadn't expected to see his daughter there. Especially not alone. Especially not with her shoulders so tense. They went into his office. She closed the door. And for the first time, she told him everything. But not just about that morning. About the comments. The stares. The C on the poem. The silences that screamed. And Marcus listened. Every word. Every pause. Every shaky breath. He didn't speak right away. He let the weight of her experience settle in the room. Then he picked up the phone. And everything that followed would unravel the carefully guarded image of Eastbridge Academy, and of the teacher who believed herself untouchable. But Ayanna wasn't thinking about that yet. She wasn't planning revenge. She wasn't imagining the fallout. She was just tired. Of pretending she didn't notice. Of making herself smaller. Of being polite when it cost her peace. This wasn't just about hair. It never had been. It was about power. And what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you pretend not to see the damage being done? Ayanna wasn't invisible anymore. She was ready. And what no one, not even her father, realized, was that this quiet fire in her chest was about to burn through every lie the school had built to protect its own. What would happen when truth walked into a room full of silence? That was a question no one at Eastbridge was prepared to answer. Not yet. Marcus Green didn't sleep that night. After Ayanna left his office, he sat alone at his desk, staring at the walls as if they might answer the questions racing through his mind. He had come to Eastbridge believing he could transform the system from within, bring justice into a structure that had, for too long, protected the wrong people. But he hadn't expected the ugliness to hit so close to home, so fast, and so publicly. The image of his daughter sitting across from him, her voice steady but eyes dimmed by exhaustion, haunted him. She didn't want vengeance. She wasn't even asking for him to do anything. She simply told the truth, and in that truth, he saw all the cracks beneath the polished surface he trusted. That night, he reviewed every file, every teacher evaluation, every parent complaint that had ever mentioned Elaine Huxley. He wasn't looking for proof of guilt. He was looking for patterns. And what he found chilled him. There were no official strikes, no formal complaints, but there were comments. Repeated. Subtle. Persistent. Parents of students of color who had requested class changes. Notes about classroom management concerns. Anonymous survey responses that hinted at unfair treatment. It had all been there, scattered like puzzle pieces no one had taken the time to connect. Until now. The next morning, Marcus called an emergency meeting with the assistant principal and the school counselor, Ms. Jennings, a sharp, empathetic woman who had worked at Eastbridge for over a decade and had her own quiet frustrations with how things were handled. He didn't mention Ayanna. Not yet. He simply laid out the incident as it had been reported, including the video, which had already begun circulating among students overnight. He wanted an internal inquiry, quiet for now, but thorough. Ms. Jennings, after watching the clip, sat in stunned silence before saying, "It's not just what she said. It's how she said it." Like Ayanna wasn't even human to her. Marcus nodded slowly and told them to proceed discreetly. The last thing he wanted was a circus, but this time, silence wasn't an option. He also requested access to all current and former student surveys from the past 3 years. Ms. Jennings agreed to assist in reviewing them. She didn't need convincing. She had seen the discomfort in her students' eyes for years, but she never had the authority or proof to act on it. Now she had both. Meanwhile, Ayanna returned to school like nothing had happened. She kept her routine. She walked the halls with the same quiet confidence. But everything had changed. Students who had barely acknowledged her presence before now watched her with new interest. Some approached her cautiously, black students, especially, sharing small nods, silent acknowledgments, or quiet, quick sentences like, "I saw the video," or, "Thank you for standing up." Ayanna never responded with more than a soft smile. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because she wasn't sure what to do with the sudden attention. She had never sought to be a symbol. But it was already happening. Mrs. Huxley, on the other hand, carried herself as if nothing had changed. Her behavior was almost more polished than usual, her tone sweeter, her comments more rehearsed. But the unease was there. The glances over her shoulder. The stiff pauses when Ayanna entered the room. One morning, as Ayanna took her seat, Mrs. Huxley approached her desk and said in a low, overly friendly voice, "I hope there are no hard feelings, dear. Sometimes my words come out harsher than I intend. We all have our bad days, don't we?" Ayanna looked up at her, calm and steady, and simply said, "Do you remember what you said to me?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Huxley blinked, her smile faltering for the briefest second, then straightened and walked away without answering. The tension in the school grew thicker with each passing day. Rumors flew through the hallways. Some students sided with Ayanna. Others defended the teacher, calling the whole thing an overreaction. A group of students in the honors track, mostly white, started whispering about how Ayanna was probably exaggerating to get attention. One even suggested she was using her father's position to get a teacher fired. Ayanna heard it all. She didn't react. But it dug deep. It reminded her how easy it was for people to rewrite the truth when it made them uncomfortable. One afternoon, Marcus asked her to stay after school for a few minutes. He wanted to be transparent now. He told her about the inquiry. About the data he had found. About the other students who had likely been mistreated. Ayanna listened, nodding slowly. Then she asked, "Are you doing this because she humiliated me or because she's hurting other kids?" Marcus hesitated, then replied, "Both. But mostly because of them. You'll be okay. You're stronger than she knows." Ayanna didn't respond right away. Then she whispered, "You always told me to be strong. But being strong doesn't stop them from trying to break you." The following week, Marcus organized a student-led listening session, framed as part of the school's Equity and Inclusion Initiative. It wasn't directly about the incident, but everyone knew. Students were invited to share their experiences anonymously or in person. Ayanna attended, sitting in the back. What she heard shook her more than she expected. A junior spoke about being constantly asked to speak on behalf of Black issues in every history class. A freshman girl described how a teacher referred to her name as too hard to pronounce and gave her a nickname without asking. A Latino student shared how his parents were called uninvolved because of their limited English, even though they worked 2 jobs and attended every meeting they could. It wasn't just about Mrs. Huxley. It was about a system of small, relentless wounds that never healed. After the session, Ms. Jennings approached Ayanna. "Do you want to say something too?" she asked. Ayanna shook her head at first. But later that evening, she sent an email asking if she could speak at the next session. Not anonymously. Not from the back. Out loud. The announcement that Ayanna Green would speak sparked buzz throughout the school. Some students were excited. Others skeptical. Faculty were nervous. Mrs. Huxley remained quiet. But her eyes followed Ayanna in the hallways now, like a shadow always watching. The day of the second session arrived. The auditorium filled quickly. Marcus sat near the back, letting his daughter have her space. When Ayanna walked up to the podium, there was a quiet that fell over the room, not fear, not reverence, but the weight of expectation. She adjusted the mic, looked out at the crowd. And began to speak. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply told the truth. About how it feels to shrink. About how silence isn't peace. About the difference between discipline and discrimination. She described the slow erosion of dignity that happens when every question is doubted, every word corrected, every part of you deemed too much. Her voice didn't crack. But her honesty sliced through the air like glass. She ended with one sentence that made the room go still. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to feel like I belonged." After she stepped down, no one clapped right away. They were still processing. Still catching up to the emotional gravity she had just delivered. Then, slowly, applause began, not wild, not loud, but steady, rising like a tide. But outside the auditorium, things were beginning to unravel faster than anyone expected. Ms. Jennings had compiled a report. The internal inquiry had uncovered more. A former student had emailed the school board with a written testimony. Another parent had demanded a formal review. And someone, no one knew who, had sent a copy of the original classroom video to a local education blog. The post went viral overnight. Now there was pressure. Public pressure. Media pressure. And Mrs. Huxley was no longer able to pretend nothing had happened. The next morning, she was called into a meeting. No students knew what was happening behind those doors. But Ayanna noticed something in the hallway as she walked to class, an unfamiliar stiffness in the teachers' faces, a buzz in the office, eyes avoiding hers as if they knew something was about to shift. By lunchtime, whispers were spreading like wildfire. But no one knew yet what would be said in that closed-door meeting. No one except the people inside. And one of them was about to make a decision that would flip the entire story on its head. The door to the conference room clicked shut with a dull finality that made the silence inside stretch even tighter. The walls, glass on three sides, seemed to trap the tension like heat under a dome. Marcus sat at the head of the long table, his hands folded tightly in front of him, his face unreadable. To his right was Ms. Jennings, who had been silent since entering, a folder clutched in her lap. Across from them sat Mrs. Elaine Huxley. Her blazer was a deep navy, her earrings small gold studs, her expression composed but guarded, as if she'd spent the morning rehearsing every potential scenario and response. Her bag sat neatly beside her chair, as if she were confident she'd walk out the same way she walked in. The meeting had been called without agenda. Just one word, urgent. But everyone in the room knew what it was about. The murmurs had reached every hallway. The article had been published the night before and now lived in hundreds of inboxes. The video had been viewed over 80,000 times. Comments flooded in from parents, alumni, and strangers alike. Some called for accountability. Others demanded resignations. It had gone far beyond a school issue now. It was public. It was political. And it was personal, especially to the girl at the center of it all, who wasn't in the room, but whose presence was felt like a pulse beneath the floor. Marcus began slowly. His voice was calm, each word weighed like a stone before it was spoken. He laid out the timeline. The initial complaint. The video. The responses collected in the listening sessions. The additional student testimonies. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The facts landed like thunder, low and steady, undeniable. As he spoke, Mrs. Huxley sat perfectly still, but her eyes twitched, the kind of twitch that reveals more than an outburst ever could. Her fingers tightened around the pen she held, but she said nothing until the very end. When Marcus finished, there was a pause. Ms. Jennings shifted slightly, opened her folder, and handed over the compiled report. Dozens of pages. Documented student experiences, classroom transcripts, previous disciplinary notes that had been buried. It was damning. And still, Mrs. Huxley said nothing. Then finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, slightly strained, but measured. I understand the concern. I do. But I think it's important to remember who I am to this school. I've dedicated my entire career here. My record has been spotless. These incidents, they're being framed unfairly, and the students, they're emotional, they're teenagers. Context matters. Nuance matters. Marcus didn't flinch. So you're denying that you said those words? I'm saying they're being taken out of context. I was addressing a dress code issue. I would have said the same to any student who, you wouldn't have, Marcus interrupted, his voice low but sharp, finally allowing the anger to show. You didn't. That's the point. Elaine's face hardened slightly, but she didn't back down. So what now? You're going to ruin my career over a moment taken out of context. Because your daughter felt uncomfortable. This is personal for you, Marcus, whether you admit it or not. He stood slowly, and the air shifted. You're right, he said, stepping around the table, closer, but not threatening. Just present. It is personal. Because this school is personal to me. Because every student here matters. Not just the ones whose parents donate to the Booster Club. Not just the ones whose names you've bothered to learn. Every single one. Including the ones who walk into this building knowing the world is already against them. I trusted you with their minds. And you used that power to remind them of their place. That's not education. That's harm. Elaine blinked fast, her jaw set. I have tenure. Ms. Jennings finally spoke, her voice steady. Tenure doesn't protect misconduct. And this is no longer an isolated complaint. It's a pattern. And we have the data to prove it. Silence again. For the first time, Mrs. Huxley's composure began to crack. Her breath caught for half a second. She looked between them, searching for some lifeline that wasn't there. I've given this place everything, she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly. Then you should understand why I have to take it back. He handed her a letter. Pre-written. Final. Termination effective immediately, pending school board confirmation. The room didn't explode. There was no shouting. No begging. Just a long, cold silence as Mrs. Huxley read the letter. She stood, slowly, folding the paper in half. She didn't thank them. She didn't protest. She simply picked up her bag, straightened her spine, and walked to the door. But before she stepped out, she paused. She didn't turn around when she said it. I hope she knows what she started. Marcus didn't respond. He let the door close behind her. When he returned to his office, Ayanna was waiting. She hadn't asked to be there. But somehow, she knew. She always knew. He sat down across from her, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Finally, she spoke. Is it over? He sighed, shaking his head. Not yet. But it started. She nodded, slowly. Then looked out the window, where a small group of students gathered near the front steps, talking, laughing, unaware of the storm that had just passed overhead. What happens now? She asked. He smiled, just slightly. Now, we give them something better. Later that week, the school announced a new initiative, a permanent student equity committee, chaired by peers and overseen by a rotating team of counselors and faculty allies. Ayanna was offered the opportunity to speak at the first official assembly. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to relive it. She didn't want to be the girl from the video. But something inside her had shifted. A weight, maybe. Or a purpose. The day of the assembly, the gymnasium filled quickly. Students sat in folding chairs, teachers lined the back walls. Marcus stood off to the side, arms crossed, letting her take the stage alone. Ayanna stepped up to the microphone. No note cards. No script. Just truth. She didn't talk about Mrs. Huxley. Not once. She talked about silence. About how it shapes people. About how growing up as a black girl in predominantly white spaces means learning to survive in the in-between. She spoke about strength, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that lives in holding your ground when no one else will stand beside you. She spoke about identity, and pride, and the long, hard road to belonging. And at the very end, her voice softened. I didn't ask to be in that video. I didn't ask for this spotlight. But now that it's here, I'm not going to waste it. Because the next time someone like me sits in that classroom, I want them to know they don't have to shrink. The room didn't move. Not for a long time. Then the applause began. Not forced. Not polite. But real. Rising. Surrounding her. In the back of the room, Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second. Not because it was over. But because something new had begun. And none of them, not Ayanna, not Marcus, not even the students in the seats, were ready for what was coming next. Because outside the gym doors, a reporter waited with a camera crew. And the real story was only just beginning. The camera light hit Ayanna's face the moment she stepped out of the gymnasium. She squinted, not from the brightness, but from the unexpected reality of what stood waiting beyond those doors, a local news reporter with a mic already lifted, her voice quick and eager as she began firing questions. The crowd of students parted instinctively, the buzzing in the air thick with curiosity. Ayanna looked over her shoulder, searching for her father, and Marcus was already there, his expression calm but alert, stepping in slowly, ready to intervene if needed. But before he could speak, Ayanna raised her hand gently. It was the smallest gesture, but it held so much power. He stopped. Trusted her. The reporter, sensing permission, continued, her voice professional but clearly chasing something headline-worthy. She asked about the speech, the incident with the teacher, the viral video, the firing. Ayanna listened, eyes steady, letting every word land before responding. And when she finally did, her voice was clear, not rehearsed, not defensive, just real. She said she hadn't come to Eastbridge to be a symbol. She came to learn. To grow. To exist without apology. But the moment she was forced to defend her identity, she realized staying quiet would mean accepting things that weren't acceptable anymore. She didn't say the teacher's name. She didn't point fingers. Instead, she looked directly into the camera and said, "This isn't about one person. It's about how we decide to treat each other when no one's watching. Because eventually, someone always is." The footage aired that evening. Local news led with it. The clip spread further online, and this time, it wasn't just the video of a racist comment, it was the story of the girl who answered it with grace. Ayanna's voice was suddenly everywhere. Interviews. Podcasts. Messages pouring in from other students across the country. Black girls with similar stories. Teachers who said they were rethinking their language. Parents who wrote long emails saying, "Thank you for showing my daughter she's not alone." Ayanna tried to carry it all, but some days it felt too heavy. She wasn't used to the attention. She didn't want to become some walking example of resilience. One night, long after the house had gone quiet, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the glass window. Her curls were loose around her shoulders. Her eyes, tired. Marcus walked in, holding a cup of tea, and sat across from her without saying a word. For a long while, they didn't speak. Just silence. Then Ayanna whispered, "What if I'm not as strong as they think I am?" Marcus didn't try to fix it. He just leaned in, elbows on the table, and said softly, "Then they'll have to learn that strength isn't just about holding everything up. It's also about knowing when to put something down." Ayanna swallowed hard. She didn't want to cry, but her eyes betrayed her. She blinked fast, voice barely audible. "I'm scared that this is going to be the only thing people ever see when they look at me." Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we'll remind them who you are. Every time." The school board held its formal vote the following week. Though the decision to terminate Mrs. Huxley had already been made internally, public procedure required a final hearing. A quiet tension fell over the boardroom that morning. A few supporters of the former teacher had shown up, mostly older staff, a couple of well-known parents who praised her discipline and high standards. But the student voices came louder. A group of Ayanna's classmates, including some who had never spoken up before, stood to read statements. One boy recounted how he had been moved to the back of the classroom without reason. A girl described how she had stopped raising her hand in class altogether because she was tired of being dismissed. The board listened. And in the final vote, the result was unanimous. The termination was upheld. Marcus stepped outside, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Ayanna, standing near the edge of the crowd, and saw something new in her posture. Not relief. Not victory. But presence. A groundedness. Like she finally believed she had the right to take up space. What neither of them expected, though, was the letter that arrived the next morning. It was from Mrs. Huxley. Not emailed. Not typed. A handwritten envelope addressed to Marcus Green, delivered directly to the front office. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, folded once. No greeting. Just a few lines. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who hurt someone like that. I convinced myself I was above it. But I watched the video. I listened to that girl speak. And I saw what I couldn't see in the mirror before. I'm sorry. Not because I lost my job. But because I forgot what it meant to be a teacher. Marcus didn't show Ayanna the letter at first. He debated whether it mattered. Whether it would heal or reopen something. But that night, after dinner, he sat her down and read it aloud. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked, "Do you think she meant it?" Marcus shrugged. "I think, maybe she's starting to." Ayanna leaned back in her chair, eyes on the ceiling. "I don't know if that changes anything." He nodded. "It doesn't have to." There was no fanfare after that. No dramatic redemption arc. Mrs. Huxley disappeared from the school's narrative, her name removed from staff pages and classroom doors. But what Ayanna had started didn't disappear. The equity committee grew. Monthly listening circles became permanent parts of the curriculum. Teachers began attending anti-bias workshops. And slowly, very slowly, the tone of the school began to shift. One afternoon, Ayanna was walking through the courtyard when she noticed a younger girl sitting alone, head down, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Ayanna recognized the posture instantly. That tension. That smallness. She walked over, sat down beside her without speaking. After a few moments, the girl looked up. Her eyes were red. Her hair, in thick braids, was messy, one side starting to unravel. She mumbled, "They said it was too much, that I should just wear it straight if I wanted to fit in." Ayanna didn't react with outrage. She didn't storm off to find whoever said it. She just reached into her backpack, pulled out a hair tie, and handed it to the girl. Then she smiled. "Let's fix it together." In that moment, under the trees and between the echoes of footsteps and laughter, Ayanna became something bigger than a headline. Bigger than a story. She became someone's beginning. And even though she didn't know it yet, her name would one day be printed on a scholarship created in her honor. Not because she was a victim. But because she refused to stay quiet when it would have been easier to disappear. Marcus watched from a distance, his chest heavy with a kind of pride that went beyond words. He had come to this school thinking he was the one who would lead change. But it had been his daughter all along. Quiet. Relentless. Unapologetic. And now, with the hardest part behind them, they could finally begin again, on their terms. But what Ayanna still didn't know was that a state representative, who had seen the video and read her speech, had just drafted a proposal in her name, a bill aimed at mandating cultural competency training in all public schools across the district. It hadn't passed yet. It hadn't even reached the floor. But it existed. Because of her. And that was only the beginning. The days that followed the hearing unfolded with a strange mix of clarity and confusion. On one hand, the outcome was concrete. A teacher with a long-standing reputation was no longer part of the institution she had helped shape, and a student who once felt like a shadow in her own classroom now stood at the heart of a movement. On paper, it looked like closure. But real life doesn't move in straight lines, and the emotional weight of what had happened lingered long after the final decision was made. Ayanna returned to her routine, her classes, her books, but nothing felt like before. Not because she regretted what had happened, but because now, every hallway, every face, every whisper carried the echoes of something larger, the question of what justice really looks like when you've already paid the price for simply being visible. There was admiration, of course. People smiled at her now in ways they hadn't before. Teachers nodded with cautious respect, some awkwardly trying to strike up conversations they'd never bothered with in the past. Students she barely knew thanked her between classes, asked for her opinions on things, wanted her guidance on their own issues. And while a part of her felt empowered by the shift, another part felt suffocated. She hadn't asked to be everyone's voice. She had simply used her own when it mattered. But now, it felt like every move she made would be seen as either too bold or not enough. One afternoon, Ayanna was called into the counselor's office. Ms. Jennings welcomed her in with that same calm presence, the room quiet except for the ticking of the small wall clock. She offered Ayanna a seat, and after a moment of silence, spoke carefully. She explained that the school board had received a formal request from a regional education committee asking if Ayanna would be willing to participate in a public forum about educational equity. It was optional. Voluntary. But her name had come up more than once, and they believed her story could have impact far beyond Eastbridge. Ayanna sat still, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. She asked, "Do they want to hear me? Or do they just want to look like they're listening?" Ms. Jennings didn't have an answer ready. After a beat, she said, "Only you can decide if it's worth your voice." That night, Ayanna brought it up with Marcus. They sat in the living room, the sound of a late rain pattering against the windows, the air thick with the kind of silence that only exists between people who know each other too well to need small talk. He listened, didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly as she spoke. When she asked him what he thought she should do, he hesitated for the first time in weeks. He told her it was a moment of power, but also a moment of risk. That stepping into a public role could turn her into something she never meant to be, a symbol for people who might not truly care about her well-being, only the narrative she represents. But then he told her something else. He said, "You don't have to carry the weight of the world, Ayanna. But if you choose to speak, speak for yourself. That's more than enough." The next day, she declined the invitation. Politely. Clearly. She said she needed time, space, and most of all, to be a teenager again, one who was still figuring out who she was without a microphone in her face. The committee thanked her and said the door would remain open. Ayanna felt a small sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't refusal out of fear, it was control. And for the first time in a long while, she felt that the story was hers again. But even with that decision behind her, the world around her didn't slow down. The school continued to evolve. New policies were drafted. Teachers underwent mandatory training. A diverse panel of parents and students was created to oversee cultural climate in classrooms. Some faculty resisted quietly. Others embraced the change with performative enthusiasm. And then there were those who genuinely tried, who pulled Ayanna aside and asked real questions, who owned their mistakes, who apologized not for being called out, but for not having noticed sooner. These were the moments that mattered most. The quiet acknowledgments. The honest attempts to do better. Still, there were consequences no one talked about. A few of Ayanna's classmates began to pull away, not with cruelty, but with a subtle kind of distance. Some felt intimidated by her presence now, unsure how to talk to her without saying the wrong thing. Others felt resentful, as if her story had taken over the school's identity. She noticed the shift. Felt the gap grow. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether the cost of visibility was too high. Whether justice always demanded a loneliness that no one warns you about. At home, things were steady but quiet. Marcus threw himself deeper into his work, determined to maintain the integrity of the changes they'd started. But Ayana noticed the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he sometimes lingered at the kitchen sink long after the dishes were done. He was proud. But he was tired. And so was she. Then came the email. It was from a parent in the district. Not angry. Not supportive. Just, questioning. The message was long, wordy, and filled with what Marcus called soft resistance, the kind that wears a smile while undermining your entire foundation. The parent questioned the fairness of the termination. Suggested that maybe the incident had been blown out of proportion. That perhaps the school had sacrificed an experienced educator in an effort to appear progressive. The email ended with a line that read, "I'm just worried we're letting emotions dictate policy." Marcus read the email out loud to Ayana. She listened, her face calm, her fingers tracing the edge of the kitchen table. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "I want to write back." He looked at her, surprised. She met his eyes. "Not to defend myself," she said, "but to explain why this wasn't just emotional. Why it mattered." And so she did. Her email wasn't angry. It was precise. She outlined the pattern of behavior, the testimony of other students, the documented history. She talked about the difference between emotion and impact. About how dismissing someone's experience as emotional was a way to erase it. She ended the email with a single sentence, "If you're not uncomfortable, you're not paying attention." She sent it. A day later, the parent responded. Brief. One line. "Thank you. I hadn't considered it that way." The moment felt small. But it meant everything. Not because it changed the world. But because it proved it could. Ayana continued her role in the Student Equity Committee but took a step back from public attention. She focused on her writing, on her friendships, on rebuilding parts of her life that had been put on hold during the storm. And in doing so, she discovered something else, that healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing what happens next. But life doesn't pause after justice. There were still challenges. New ones. Like when a substitute teacher mispronounced her name 3 times in a row and then laughed when she corrected him. Or when another student repeated a racist joke under his breath and claimed it was just a meme. These moments didn't stop. But Ayana faced them differently now. She didn't always react. She didn't always fight. Sometimes, she walked away. Sometimes, she documented. Sometimes, she just looked them in the eye long enough for them to understand that silence didn't mean surrender. One day, as the school year neared its end, Ms. Jennings approached Ayana in the hallway. She mentioned that there would be an awards assembly coming up, and that the faculty had nominated Ayana for the Unity Leadership Award, a new recognition created in response to the year's events. Ayana listened, then tilted her head slightly. "Is it for me? Or for them?" Ms. Jennings smiled, not patronizingly, but with warmth. "For what you made possible. And for the way you did it." Ayana nodded, but didn't respond right away. That night, she told Marcus she didn't want to accept the award publicly. She didn't want the spotlight. Not this time. Instead, she asked if the school could use that moment to announce the launch of a scholarship, one not in her name, but dedicated to students who had been silenced, overlooked, or erased. Marcus didn't respond with words. He just pulled her into a long, quiet hug. As the assembly approached, Ayana stood backstage, hidden from view, watching as students filed into the auditorium. Her heart beat slower now. Not because she was nervous. But because she was grounded. Because she finally knew who she was outside of the noise. But as she watched the principal step up to the microphone and begin his speech, she felt a question rise inside her, not a doubt, not a fear, but a moral question. Had she done enough? Had she used her voice to build something lasting? Or had she just won one fight in a war that never really ends? And more importantly, was she ready for whatever came next? Backstage, Ayana stood just behind the velvet curtain, her arms wrapped around herself, not from nerves, but from the heaviness of everything she had carried. The auditorium buzzed with muted chatter, the scraping of folding chairs, the occasional thump of a dropped backpack, and the hum of a sound system being tested one last time. On stage, the assistant principal adjusted the microphone as the projector lit up with the school's crest and the title of the event, Voices of Change, Honoring Courage in Community. Ayana's name wasn't printed anywhere on the banners or the programs. She had asked for that. And yet, everyone in that room knew she was the reason they were there. The air was thick with anticipation, not because anyone expected drama, but because something had shifted in the school's fabric, and this ceremony was the thread meant to stitch it all together. But Ayana wasn't sure anything could be sewn up so easily. Marcus found her behind the curtain just before the program began. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. For a man who had spent years commanding boardrooms and crisis meetings, his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he glanced at her and asked quietly if she was okay. Ayana exhaled slowly, then said she wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. He nodded, understanding more in her tone than her words. Then she looked at him, her eyes soft but searching, and asked, "Do you think people really change?" Marcus paused. It wasn't a rhetorical question. She wasn't talking about policy or politics. She was talking about hearts. About minds. About the quiet racism that isn't loud or violent but just dismissive, subtle, constant. He rubbed the back of his neck and answered honestly. Some do. Some try. And some don't. But the ones who do, they're the reason we keep speaking. Ayana let the words settle inside her, not as comfort, but as truth. The curtain began to rise slowly, and the applause swelled. Marcus gave her hand a gentle squeeze before stepping away. Ayana didn't step onto the stage. Instead, she moved to the side, watching from the shadows. The assistant principal welcomed the crowd, spoke briefly about the year's challenges, the courage of students who had spoken up, the importance of listening, growing, evolving. Then she introduced Ms. Jennings, who walked up with her signature calm, holding a small white envelope. She spoke without a script, her voice warm and grounded. She talked about the power of story, not just loud stories, but the quiet ones, the kind that move through a community like wind, invisible but undeniable. She said this year had been a year of reckoning, of listening to what wasn't said aloud before, and that among all the changes, one student had reminded the entire school what it meant to lead with integrity. Then she opened the envelope and read the name of the first Unity Scholarship recipient. It wasn't Ayana. It was a freshman named DeAndre, the same boy who had spoken during the listening session, the one who had once been moved to the back of the classroom without explanation. He stepped onto the stage, his face stunned, his hands shaking as he accepted the small plaque and the scholarship announcement. The crowd erupted in applause, loud and genuine. Ayana smiled from the wings, her eyes wet. That was what she wanted. That right there. Not recognition. Not revenge. But change, tangible, living change. Later, as the ceremony ended and students filtered out in small groups, Ayana stayed behind. The stage was empty, the lights dimmed, and the room was quieter now, filled only with the soft murmur of lingering voices. Ms. Jennings approached her gently, sitting beside her in the front row. For a while, they said nothing. Then Ayana asked if she thought things would stay this way, or if they'd eventually go back. Ms. Jennings didn't offer false hope. She said some things might slide, as they always do. People get comfortable. Institutions forget. But others wouldn't. Because stories, once told, don't disappear. They echo. And sometimes, they become part of the foundation. The next week, Ayana received another letter, this time from someone unexpected. It came in a plain envelope, no return address. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Inside was a short note, written in uneven script. I watched your speech. I've been quiet for too long. When she told me to stay silent last year, I did. I thought if I just kept my head down, it would pass. But you made me realize I wasn't crazy. I'm sorry I didn't speak up then. Thank you for doing what I couldn't. There was no name signed, but Ayanna knew. It was another student. Someone who had been there, who had felt it too, and who had been afraid. Her chest tightened. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in her journal, and sat there for a long time, the weight of it both a burden and a blessing. One afternoon in English class, the substitute who had once mocked her name walked in again. This time, when he paused at roll call, staring at her name like it was unfamiliar, Ayanna raised her hand before he could speak and said, "It's Ayanna." Like honor with an A in front. The class went silent for a moment, then moved on. But Ayanna saw something in his face shift. Not shame, exactly. But awareness. And that was enough. In the months that followed, Ayanna began writing more, not for school, but for herself. She wrote poems, essays, quiet reflections. Her voice, once cautious and reserved, had become precise, steady, brave. Ms. Jennings encouraged her to submit one of her pieces to a regional youth writing contest. Ayanna hesitated, then chose a piece titled "The Things We Don't Say." It was about fear. About silence. About reclaiming voice not with volume but with truth. She submitted it. Weeks later, she received word that her piece had won. Not just placed, won. It would be published in a statewide anthology, and she was invited to read it at the state capitol during a youth arts day. She almost declined again. But Marcus reminded her, gently, that speaking doesn't always mean carrying a cause. Sometimes, it just means being heard. The day of the reading, Ayanna stood at the podium, a small card in her hand, a microphone in front of her. She looked out at the room filled with students, educators, community leaders, and she saw faces like hers, and unlike hers, all waiting. She didn't tremble. She didn't rush. She read every word slowly, letting them land. And when she finished, the applause wasn't just for the writing. It was for the space she had created, a space where truth didn't have to shout to be felt. Back at Eastbridge, the end of the year approached. Seniors prepared for graduation. Clubs wrapped up their projects. And Ayanna, though still only a freshman, was invited to speak briefly at the final assembly. She agreed this time, but asked to go last. When she stepped onto the stage, the sun was shining through the tall windows, casting gold across the seats. She stood tall, looked out at her peers, and said that schools should be places of safety, of challenge, of growth, but most of all, of dignity. She said that change doesn't happen when people whisper it in hallways. It happens when it walks into the light. And then she ended with the words she had written months ago in her journal, the words she now believed more than ever. We don't speak because we're strong. We speak to become strong. The silence that followed was full. Whole. And in that silence, something beautiful settled into the bones of that building, the kind of change that doesn't get erased when the school year ends. Ayanna stepped down from the stage, not as the girl who had once been silenced, but as the young woman who refused to stay that way. And though the room was filled with people, she felt light. Because now, finally, she didn't feel like a symbol. She felt like herself. The summer arrived slower than expected, like it knew the year had been too heavy to end in a rush. The air in Eastbridge felt different, not entirely cleansed, but lighter, like the windows had been opened for the first time in years. Hallway walls that had once echoed with a quiet, unsettling tension were now covered in student artwork, stories, quotes about identity, and handwritten commitments to respect. It was subtle but undeniable. A new culture was forming. Not perfect. Not sudden. But real. And at the center of that quiet shift was Ayanna, still moving through the halls with her usual calm, but with a difference no one could quite name, something steady, unshakable, earned. One morning, just a few days before the end-of-year awards banquet, Ayanna sat with her friend Camilla under the giant oak tree that shaded the far end of the courtyard. Camilla had been one of the few people who never treated Ayanna differently before or after the events that shook the school. Their friendship had grown in the spaces between all the noise, shared books, exchanged playlists, long conversations about art and belonging. Camilla was sketching in her notebook, the tip of her pencil dancing across the page, while Ayanna sat with her legs stretched out, head tilted toward the sky. She was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. She asked, "Do you ever feel like people only see the loudest part of your story?" Camilla didn't look up right away. She kept sketching, then said softly, "Yeah. Especially when the loudest part is the part you didn't choose." Ayanna turned her head to look at her. Camilla continued, "But maybe that's why we make things. Art, stories, poems. So people can see the rest of it too." Ayanna nodded slowly. It was true. She had been writing more than ever lately. Not just about what happened, but about joy, memory, imagination. Things that belonged to her, and not just the narrative the world had assigned her. She wanted people to see her whole, not in pieces. And maybe she was finally learning how to do that for herself too. Later that day, as she walked past the main office, the receptionist called her name. She handed Ayanna a small envelope, no name on the front, just the word "read." Inside was a typed letter on plain paper. The words were brief but carefully chosen. It was from the parent who had questioned her months ago, the one who had worried that emotions were driving policy. The letter was an apology. Sincere. They had watched her speech again. Read her writing. Listen to their own child, who had spoken about how much the school had changed this year, and how Ayanna had made it feel more like home. The final line read, "I didn't understand what it cost you, but I do now. I hope someday, when the world is better, we'll remember who helped start the change." Ayanna folded the letter slowly and held it for a moment, her fingers pressed to the paper like she was trying to absorb something deeper than ink. That night, she shared the letter with Marcus. He read it twice, then handed it back without comment. Ayanna could see it in his face, the pride, yes, but also the quiet ache of a father who had watched his child carry more than she ever should have had to. He didn't say what he was feeling. He didn't have to. Instead, he asked if she'd thought about what she might want to do next year. He told her there was an opening on the student council. That her voice could be useful there, but only if it was something she wanted. Ayanna looked at him, thoughtful. Then she said, "I'm tired of fighting for a seat at the table. Maybe it's time to build a new one." Marcus smiled, eyes warm with something more than approval, recognition. She wasn't just his daughter. She was becoming her own force. The banquet was held in the auditorium, the same space where Ayanna had once delivered her speech, where the school had begun its slow transformation. This time, though, there were no speeches for her to give. No spotlights. She was just a student, sitting among friends, watching as classmates received awards for sports, academics, leadership. And it felt good, to just be. When her name was called for the Student Voice Award, a title created specifically for those who had made measurable contributions to school culture, she stood, accepted the plaque, smiled, and returned to her seat without ceremony. She didn't need the stage. Her work had already taken root. After the event, as people trickled out and the lights began to dim, Ms. Jennings caught up with her by the back wall. She handed Ayanna a manila folder. Inside were several letters, all anonymous, from students who had written reflections for a final assignment in the Cultural Studies elective that had been introduced that semester. Their words weren't about Ayanna directly, but her presence was in all of them. Mentions of feeling safe enough to speak. Of finding the courage to challenge a teacher's assumption. Of feeling seen for the first time. Ms. Jennings didn't say much, I thought you'd want to know. Ayanna held the folder to her chest for a long second, then whispered, I didn't know it had reached that far. Ms. Jennings smiled. It always does. You just don't always get to see it. That weekend, Ayanna took the long way home from the bookstore, walking past the front gate of Eastbridge. It was closed for the evening, the building quiet. She stood there for a few minutes, looking at the school, not with bitterness, but with a kind of gratitude that had taken months to grow. She didn't forgive everything. She didn't forget. But she had found something deeper, the power of having reclaimed her place without waiting for permission. She didn't know what the next year would bring. Maybe more questions. Maybe more resistance. Maybe more quiet victories. But she was no longer afraid of any of it. The fear that once whispered she was too small had been replaced by a voice that belonged entirely to her, firm, focused, and free. That night, as the sunset painted her bedroom walls with soft orange light, Ayanna opened her journal and began a new page. She titled it, What I Know Now. She started writing, not for anyone else, not for school, not for a stage, just for her. Words spilled out in long sentences, messy and unfiltered, honest in a way only private writing can be. She wrote about strength, not as defiance, but as staying present when it's easier to disappear. She wrote about truth, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. And she wrote about justice, not the kind that comes with applause, but the kind that sits quietly beside you, reminding you that you were right to speak, even if no one clapped. Downstairs, Marcus turned off the porch light and glanced out at the driveway, where Ayanna's bike leaned against the garage. He didn't need to check on her. He could feel it, the peace settling in, the storm having passed, not erased, but transformed. He had always taught her to think critically, to lead with compassion, but now he was the one learning from her, about courage, about patience, about the kind of strength that doesn't demand attention, but earns it with grace. At school, the walls no longer carried her face or her name. But her presence lingered in the quiet choices, in how teachers asked questions, how classmates paused before laughing at something that used to go unchallenged, how new students of color walked with a bit more certainty down the corridors. The story had shifted. Not ended. Not perfected. But opened. And Ayanna, as she closed her journal and turned off the light, understood something she hadn't known at the beginning of the year. That justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. One built not just by standing up once, but by choosing, over and over, to keep standing. And she would. Because now, she knew exactly who she was. The final days of the school year moved like chapters closing themselves, one by one, as if the building itself understood that something meaningful had been written within its walls. There were no more viral videos, no speeches, no breaking points, just a quiet return to rhythm, a steadiness that carried with it the weight of change. Ayanna walked those halls not as a figure watched or whispered about, but as someone finally seen. The space she occupied no longer felt like borrowed ground. It was hers, earned not through a title or an award, but through endurance, through voice, and through the simple fact that she never stopped showing up, even when it would have been easier to stay home, to stay quiet, to stay safe. She had stayed, and because of that, the school itself had moved. As the summer ended and a new school year approached, Ayanna was invited to help lead a student mentorship program, something she had quietly suggested months ago that was now finally coming to life. It wasn't flashy. No banners, no assemblies. Just circles of students meeting after school, talking honestly, building the kind of connection that had once been missing. Ayanna didn't speak from a pedestal. She listened more than she talked. She created space for others the way she had once needed for herself. And in doing so, she became more than just a survivor of an incident. She became a builder of something new. Camilla, her closest friend, went on to organize the first student art exhibition centered on identity and culture. Her sketches, once hidden in notebooks, now lined the walls of the library, drawing in conversations that hadn't existed before. The exhibit became an annual tradition, and Camilla credited Ayanna for reminding her that even quiet art has power when it's rooted in truth. Their friendship deepened in the small moments: walks home, coffee shop afternoons, whispered jokes between meetings, a friendship that never asked Ayanna to perform her pain, only to be herself. Ms. Jennings, whose quiet strength had been one of Ayanna's earliest sources of support, was promoted to Director of Student Advocacy, a role that had never existed at Eastbridge before. It was created in recognition of how necessary it was to have adults within the system who were willing to listen, to challenge the status quo, and to stand beside students when others failed them. She never sought credit, but when Ayanna handed her a copy of her published essay, the one that had won statewide recognition, Ms. Jennings smiled and said, "This is exactly why I stayed all those years. So I could be here when you arrived." Marcus, once burdened by the guilt of not having seen the truth sooner, found a new rhythm in his role. The fire in him returned, but this time it burned slower, wiser. He became known across the district not just as a capable director, but as someone who took action without fanfare, who protected students without hesitation. His relationship with Ayanna grew even deeper, not just as father and daughter, but as two people who had weathered something profound together and emerged not broken, but transformed. He never forgot what it cost her. And he never let it happen again to anyone under his watch. And Mrs. Huxley? Her name faded from the school's memory with time, no longer spoken in hallways, no longer feared or defended. But somewhere in a different district, a former teacher sat in a classroom as a student, not to teach, but to learn. After her termination, she enrolled in a graduate course focused on racial equity in education. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a step, one she took quietly, without announcement, without expectation. And maybe that was enough. Maybe she, too, was learning what Ayanna had always known, that change starts not when we speak the loudest, but when we finally listen. On a crisp fall morning, Ayanna stood outside the same auditorium where everything had once broken open. She looked over the campus, now buzzing with new students, many of whom didn't know her story and didn't need to. That was the beauty of it. The work had been done so that others wouldn't have to carry the same weight. Her eyes settled on a group of freshmen walking together, laughing freely, one of them with hair just as bold and beautiful as hers had been that day in class. No one stared. No one mocked. It was just hair. Just her. And Ayanna smiled. She wasn't the same girl who had once wondered if she'd ever belong. She was someone who had taken every broken piece and rebuilt herself stronger, wiser, and more whole than anyone could have imagined. She had been hurt, yes. But she had never been defeated. And in the quiet of that morning, with the sun warming her face and the wind whispering through the trees, Ayanna knew, truly and deeply, that she had won. Now let's take a moment to reflect. What do we do when our identity is treated like a disruption? What do we do when the people who are supposed to protect us become the ones who inflict harm? And what happens when we choose not to shrink, but to rise, not with anger alone, but with purpose, with dignity, with unstoppable grace? Ayanna's story is not just about calling out injustice. It's about transforming it. It's about the long, hard work of turning pain into power, and silence into strength. She didn't just change a school. She changed the way people saw themselves. She reminded us that we don't have to wait for permission to take up space. We just have to claim it. So now I ask you, when you see injustice, will you speak? When someone's voice is drowned out, will you listen? And when your moment comes, as it did for Ayanna, will you stand tall or stay seated? Let us know in the comments, what part of this story resonated most with you. Have you ever felt invisible in a space where you deserve to be seen? And if you felt something while listening, if Ayanna's journey moved you, inspired you, made you reflect, make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this one. Stories that confront, that uplift, that leave you changed. Don't forget to leave a like and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, stay bold, stay kind, and never stop owning your truth.